We've made it now to day 7, and we will be talking primarily about the Middle Ages / Middle Age philosophy. I wish you could see, in fact, the notes. I mean, I can hold it up for you here, but there's just so much. My notes on this subject are just so vast in comparison to the other things we've talked about so far. Part of it is not because there's more depth here, but because in passing through this time period, we're passing over so many incredible thinkers and movements and new developments in philosophy. And I have to agree with Gaarder on this one. Unfortunately, it would seem that the majority of people who hear about the Middle Ages and associate that with the Dark Ages, which I do agree with him as well, should be only referring to a specific period at the very beginning of these Middle Ages, this time when Rome has fallen and things are indeed dark. However, to associate everything up to the 11th and 12th centuries even is bogus, absolutely unfounded. There's so much that's going on during this time period that to think that, the good stuff doesn't come again until we get to the Renaissance well into the 15th and 16th centuries is absurd. You would have to just be completely blind and deaf to the things that there are to say about this time period. Nonetheless, despite my rigorous notes and my desire to try and share and change this viewpoint on Middle Age philosophy, Middle Age philosophy, medieval philosophy for you and others, I'm going to do my best to keep it concise. I am going to touch on a couple of people that even Gaarder didn't, I think, fairly represent or bring up at all, just so that we can see the fluidity of the movement and what all was going on during this time. So, first of all, taking a look at this distinction that Gaarder is making between the Indo-European culture and the Semitic culture. Here we see a family tree of the Indo-European languages, and I want you to really take this in. Look at all these languages. Many you should recognize. You can see Greek over here is part of this line, as is Icelandic, Danish, Swedish, all the Norse, as it were, Germanic Norse languages. German itself is in here somewhere. Here's High German there. We can see Russian and Ukrainian language. We can see the Slavics and the Czechs. We can see the Persians. We think of that as the Middle East, but it's not Semitic. This is also Farsi and so forth are part of this Iranian branch. So the Romance languages, the Slavic languages, the Germanic languages, the Indian languages such as Punjabi and Hindi and Bengali. And then we've got Celtic with Irish, Gaelic, and so forth, Welsh, and then Anatolian, Albanian. So just really take in for a moment just how expansive this is. There's so much that when we say Indo-European, it's very easy to get stuck in the mindset of how this only represents one of several groups of not just languages but cultures throughout the world. Yes, but look how large it is, and or at least look how diverse it is. We'll see a comparison map in a second. Let's look at the Semitic then. Now, I don't feel like this is a great representation in a sense, because we could probably make as many branches for this as well if we chose to. But we have to recognize that the diversity certainly isn't quite at the same degree, at least in terms of language. Number of languages, if we are to recognize distinct languages, at least conventionally. So you have the West Semitic and East Semitic. Here we have Babylonian and Syrian. These end up playing a really important part of Jewish and therefore later Christian and Muslim history, with the people in the land of Canaan And then you've got, well, here the Canaanites and Phoenicians and Hebrew, which is the one that you may be most familiar with, Hebrew, or at least have heard of before. Ethiopia, when we think of Semitism, we tend to think Middle East, but the truth is that it's what we call the Afro-Asiatic line. That is, it's a whole region, and we'll see again in a second on the map. It's this whole region that includes large expanses of Africa that also are included, northern Africa, that are included in this bracket. We have also Arabic, which is the only language I'm somewhat, I should say, familiar with in terms of how the language is structured and how it works and so forth. We have Aramaic. So again, these are representations of two distinct language trees. And the reason why I wanted to show the language trees, if we take a look at the map here, is it also gives us a real pretty decent sense of the cultures that those languages are part and parcel of, that they represent. So the language and culture really go hand in hand in my view. And you can't have a culture that doesn't have language, or a language that doesn't somehow reflect, or at the very least represent, a culture. So looking at the map here, we can see these are this is sort of a pretty modern depiction of where these languages are, where the Semitic / Afro-Asiatic lines are in mostly yellow and orange over here. We'll just say pure yellow for sure. And then the light green and even some of the dark green as we get into India and so forth, this is the Indo-European. And you can see this almost sort of divide here. Now it's a little artificial because, of course, there are people on both sides of the Mediterranean Sea who can speak the other's languages, who come from those different cultures. But just think about what Gaarder is trying to represent in this book. He's trying to say, look, these two very different cultures, and more than just language, in multiple facets, are at this moment, not this one moment, but in a series of moments in this time of history, in the Middle Ages, they would seem to be separate up to this point, and then they seem to be coalescing in many ways, at least culturally speaking. So while these languages still mostly divide at this line, where a lot of what you'll find up here in Algeria and Egypt and so forth are forms of Arabic and other Aramaic languages and so forth, you come up here and you have, again, like Farsi, and then you have Germanic and European languages and Romance languages and Hindi and Greek. So the influences there between Greek and the Semitic branches of culture and language, those are super important to us, especially as we start to get into what it is that sparks so much of the philosophy and, of course, the theology and religion that's going on at this time in history, which is, of course, the event of Jesus of Nazareth being crucified, and then equally perhaps important, at least in order to have expanded that phenomenon and his messages, was Paul. Was Paul, Saint Paul now is sometimes what he's called, Saint Paul, or prior to his changing of name, Saul. And so here we see him speaking to the Athenians. And this is one of, if you can imagine, many trips that he made, places that he visited all along. If we go back to the map for a second, all along this area, he's coming from this area of Canaan, and he's traveling along here along with some of his disciples, and he's visiting these places. He gets about this far, right? Athens and so forth, but he visits the Ionian. I can't remember if he gets to Lesbos or not, but he's this whole rich area over here near Jerusalem and all the way into Greece. And this idea that he's spreading of Jesus, the message of the true God and so forth, is really different. So what is it that is so different? Well, in religious terms, there's this major difference between the polytheistic views of the Hellenes, that is, all the places that have been influenced by Hellenism and Greek thought, and then you've got the monotheism, the one godness of this Semitic view, excuse me. It's simply put, poly meaning many, right? Polytheism would seem to just promote simply the belief in multiple gods. This is where you find pantheons and Olympiads and so forth, where whether it's in more Asian cultures or simply in these more Indo-European cultures, not just in Greece, but of course, as Gaarder mentions as well, in Norse mythology, Germanic tribes also were very commonly prescribing to this idea that there's not just one god, but the gods. Why would there? Why does there have to be? Why couldn't there be multiple gods? And if anything, it's all the more interesting, maybe, would a person would think at first, because then you have different gods with different personalities. And of course, we're then slipping back into this problem that the pre-Socratics were dealing with in the first place, that those like Xenophanes were pointing out, which was, hey, they sure seem human. It seems with the polytheist pantheons and so forth, you get this sense that if you're representing different characteristics and whatnot, what kind of characteristics are they? Well, they're human characteristics. And so maybe this is part of the impetus for this new line of thought. Hey, that we talked about a long time ago already, ad nauseum at this point, that the pre-Socratics really didn't want to just associate with what is really going on, the phenomena of nature and so forth, associate that with these very human, frail, even, ridiculous sometimes characteristics of the human being that are being projected onto these deities, these gods. So what is monotheism? What's different about this? For now, let's consider this. Having one god does change things. For one thing, the way that Judaism and Islam in particular, less so Christianity, as you go further into, closer to the modern day, I should say, their depictions of this one god are rarely depictions at all. They, in fact, tend to veer away from trying too hard to depict that god. See, in order for polytheism, in order for there to be a pluralism or diversity of gods, you have to recognize what the differences are between them, what the characteristic differences are. But for the monotheistic God, the whole point is that it's omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and so forth. All these alls, this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-being, if you want to put some neologism on it, some new term on it. It makes it more, in a sense, mysterious, more cryptic. Wonderfully so, perhaps, because maybe that's where the mysticism that is so rich in a lot of not just Kabbalic, but many Jewish and Christian and Muslim, like the Sufis and so forth. These sort of mystical arenas that we talked about before, mysticism. Maybe that's what makes these so incredibly rich. Not that Eastern didn't have mysticism as well, but it's kind of hard to talk about Greek mysticism. They had mystery theaters, but that's a whole nother thing. And this is the way I like to characterize it. That the oneness of God, this sort of, hey, let's decide on one God. This one God really is going to encompass all of the mystery, all of the things that we can't explain, all of the things that make things what they are, all that is ultimately good, as we see later when they start to adopt Platonic ideas of the good and so forth, and Aristotelian too for that matter. Then let's make one single entity represent that. There's a something of a trace of that sort of, I'll use a more modern example, a corporate mindset. An international corporation goes and says, look, we could have, I don't want to use specific brand names, but we could have just one, let's call it Heal Foods, right? Heal Foods is my new international corporation. And hey, there could be lots and lots of these stores throughout the world, or at least throughout the region, that believe in these healing foods, but by operating under one single blanket umbrella corporation, then there's an ability to do things that you can't do as these separate little organizations. For instance, you can, if something is working, then you can easily pass that on to everybody else and share that, and everybody can start implementing the same strategy that works. And now that thing is getting more money and it's growing, so Heal Food sounds like a really great operation. Likewise, we can say, in a similar vein, that when cultures start to take on one essential element as operating and, in a sense, guiding everyone else, you can spread things more quickly. You can spread ideas and concepts more quickly, or perhaps you can operate or let me say execute authority more efficiently and so forth. There's, I think, a very legitimate reason why later on Constantine, who of course gave birth to Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, why Constantine as an emperor would have wanted Christianity to be among other emperors, he too would have wanted Christianity to become the official religion of the Byzantine Empire at a certain point, because, hey, this is a real unifying force. You know, instead of everybody, up to this point, Romans would come in and they would say, you know, you can operate as you do already, everybody. You can go on and have your individual gods that you represent. Of course, none of them can be more powerful than the emperor, but regardless, you can worship whatever, the calf of Baal. You can worship all your different little gods and so forth. Just recognize the emperor ultimately has the authority. And you had this very interesting diversity around that. And there was something wonderful about that too. Even though the Romans also did some extremely cruel things, they also helped in the development of civilization in some essential ways too. But now you've got this possible way of uniting people by way of culture, religious culture, a oneness. Here's God. So there's St. Paul, as I said, representing that view. And so what happens next? What comes after that? Well, we're having to fast forward quite a bit now, because we're now back in the time of Plotinus. Why are we going back to Plotinus? Didn't we graduate from Plotinus? I actually feel like Plotinus belongs a little bit more in this group. One philosopher I don't think that Gaarder even mentioned, for instance, was a student alongside Plotinus, had the same teacher, Ammonius Saccas, and his name was Origen. He is, like Plotinus, very interested in these, in this idea of course, Christianity. He had this really terrible childhood at first, where his father was taken in by the authorities and decapitated in public, and poor Origen was just absolutely distraught about it. He had issues with being a true believer and trying to be focused on the one true way of Christ and all. But he has this same sort of epiphany, similar epiphany, I should say, as Plotinus. So remember these three streams, the river that splits into three, as Gaarder describes it, where you have Platonism and you have Neoplatonism, which is created essentially by Plotinus, a blending of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas and concepts into something brand new. And then you have Aristotelianism, of course. So what is Origen prescribed to? He and many others take on this primarily Platonized Christianity, where there are the Platonic ideas and so forth, but it's not nearly the same for him as it is for Plotinus, who wants to also bring in Aristotle's hierarchy of being and all that stuff. So Origen, very important character in this development as well. He and Plotinus, operating in around the same time period, are pushing Plato back into the fold, as it were, with Plotinus giving birth to a new stream and Origen taking on, I think I said I would say Origen, doesn't matter, Origen taking on the mostly Platonic stream. Now we're going to see later on that this is really important, because Aristotle is going to be diminishing more and more. In fact, there's a lot of reason for a lot of these thinkers to avoid Aristotle. Much later on, I think Gaarder mentions this as well, those like Martin Luther even see Aristotle as this blasphemous character in the history leading up to Christianity. But there will be pushback, and we'll see the champion of Aristotle arise pretty soon. All right, here's our first major character now. I mean, Origen is great and all, But St. Augustine is one who really puts himself on the map with he's taking on Plotinus's Neoplatonism, having himself prior been a Manichaeist, having this sense already in his mind of this dichotomy between good and evil. And the question of evil, the problem of evil, is constantly on his mind. One thing that Gaarder doesn't really explain in that, by the way, is what we mean by the problem of evil specifically. Is it just simply that evil exists in the world as does God? And maybe is there just simply that tension between the one true good God and then evil in the world, despite that he created the world? There's that. But there's more to it too. There's something that comes about by his recognition of what he calls original sin. If you've never heard this before in especially Christian religious contexts, original sin is the idea that when Adam and Eve fell, when they ate from the tree of knowledge, and then they fell from God's favor, and were banished from the Garden of Eden, and so on and so forth, which you should start to recognize, hopefully, the parallels to that in this book, with the Garden of Eden being the name of the very first chapter. Go back occasionally and think about those parallels. Okay, so the original sin that is something we inherit from Adam and Eve. We don't just inherit at this time, they were very, very literal in how they approached the Bible and so forth, the Old Testament, as well as the New Testament. In taking that on, his thought is not just that we biologically inherited, say, the genetics or whatever. They didn't have an idea of genetics at the time, but the lineage, let's say, of Adam and Eve, because it was very literal. We all descended from Adam and Eve. That's the idea, right? But further, we also inherited their sin. We inherited the sin of their eating of the tree of knowledge. Now, this may sound terrible. This sounds like how dare you? Like, I'm not going to be responsible for the things that someone, even if this were true, that my ancestors were Adam and Eve, I'm not going to be responsible for what they did. But in a way, what we can see Augustine is trying to do is trying to help, trying to be merciful to human beings, because let's be honest, we all do good and bad things. And in a way, he's trying to help explain why that's the case. Up to this point, in many cases, such as with Origen and others, you're either just good or bad, and if you're bad, it's your fault. End of story. Augustine won't say that it's not your fault, but he'll say, but there's also some justification for why this happens. There's also at least a reason for why you're struggling with being good or bad in the first place. Being good here being synonymous with being good to your neighbor, doing the right thing when duty calls. Of course, in this period of history, understanding and reading the Bible and recognizing what the essential principles are and following the Ten Commandments, all of that being qualified as good. But if we separate it from the minutia and just say good versus bad, whatever good means to us right now and bad means to us right now, what a good versus a bad action would be, why do we indulge in both? And he's trying to be merciful in this way, I think. So, in a way, what Augustine's trying to do is say, look, you're struggling with good and bad is not, something that you're just simply inherently bad or good at. It's because it's not that you fell from favor from God, being pure at birth, and you yourself in your lifetime just fell from favor. No, it's not like that. You are born with this defect. You're born with the defect of the original sin that was already committed by Adam and Eve way, way, way back at the beginning. And therefore now you are going to move in the world and be challenged by this defect, as it were. How does this relate in non-Christian, non-religious context? Very much so, if you think about it. When we talk about psychology and neuroscience today, of having brains that are not designed to make good decisions sometimes, we're talking about this in a similar vein as Augustine. This almost original sin sort of concept. It's not religious, and it's not so much purely moral, but it is there, and it's important. And so this problem of evil for Augustine looks, and that he and others are wrestling with, looks something along the lines of the moral evil that we commit versus the natural evil that is this other category we won't go into very deeply, of evils that happen outside of our own decisions. And so there's something of a very I think, very comprehensive and more benevolent view of human beings in the world in Augustine in this way. We wrestle with moral evils. We wrestle with whether or not to do something, do the right thing, to not kill and to not lie, and likewise to promote happiness and to promote love and so forth. But then there's, of course, natural evils that happen in the world too, like natural disasters, where volcanoes explode and all of a sudden a whole city is wiped out of people, both good and bad. And the question becomes then, what do you do with that? What does that mean in the context of a good God who, yes, again, coming back to that initial thought, if there's a good God and he created the world or she created the world and it was all good, as they said in Genesis over and over, it's all good, then what do we do about this thing of evil? Why there's moral evil maybe makes sense to some extent now, thanks to original sin. What about natural evils? And so, I'm not going to provide all the conclusions here from Augustine, but looking into his works like City of God is a really, really enlightening way of also just delving into ethics at large. We can still ask this question of why do bad things happen to good people? This still plagues people all the time. Next up, we have Boethius. And I will spend much less time on Boethius, unfortunately, but he has a very interesting story as well. He was a massive translator and was very concerned with Aristotle being represented again. Now, if I go back for a moment to the dates of these people, I think it is enlightening. Augustine was doing his thing at around 354, 430 AD. Or AD, CE if you prefer. And that is his lifespan. Notice how that's a good bit after Plotinus and around the 200s, and Origen also around the 200s. So he's coming after that with the Neoplatonic view after Platonized Christianity has had a good hold on people for a while. And then here's Boethius coming in at around the 500s, 480 to 526 or so. CE, and he wants us to recognize that Aristotle had some major contributions as well to give, specifically this idea of choice and virtue. So if what Augustine was wrestling with is the problem of free will and making choices that are morally good despite the inhibition, the obstacle of having original sin and moral evil dwelling in us already to begin with, Boethius is wanting us to remember that it's not as simple as just grace from God whether or not we're good people. That is, for Augustine, while we are, of course, we have free will and we want to make good decisions and at the end, we're all going to commit some form of evil. There's just no way to not be bad. Just like there's no way to not experience the consequences of having a genetic disorder or something that are noticeable and can plague us in certain ways and inhibit us in certain ways. We're going to notice that at some point, and we're going to recognize that there's no way completely around that problem. For Augustine too, the grace of God is the only thing then that really can give us comfort. God then looks down and despite our moral evils can say, hey, I'm going to grant you salvation anyway. But for Boethius, he feels like this takes away some of the power of choice and free will. So he really wants to emphasize how important it is that we remember virtuous habit, virtuous action, virtuous habit, if you remember from Aristotle. And he wants to bring this back in and say, look, yes, God is truly powerful and truly important and following the path of Jesus and all that stuff. But when you read his Consolations of Philosophy, which I'll explain more about in a second, he's also very concerned that we recognize how instrumental Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were to the development of Western civilization. Without them, we'd have nothing, is practically his opinion. To have God is great, but to be without Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, we're lost, seems to be his view. Philosophy here is represented, this is the personification of philosophy. He literally, as he's waiting in death row, he's waiting for his own death for reasons that I won't go into detail around right now, but he's going to be put to death, and he's been a major intellectual. He's translated so much work. He's been so critical to a movement that we will see later on in the works of Abelard and Aquinas. He's done so much to contribute to that, and he writes in these days before his death, the Consolations of Philosophy, where he describes the philosophy as a person visiting him, sort of a spiritual, almost ghostly way, visiting him in his cell and explaining to him what we must understand about God and what we must understand about philosophy. It's very, though, in a way, unchristian, or I shouldn't say unchristian, but it seems to lack a lot of these mostly Christian and religious elements. It's mostly him receiving consolation from philosophy, of philosophy, that philosophy will continue on without him, and that people can learn from those who come before, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and make good decisions if they do more than just rely on, Christian doctrine and use their rational minds, right? So while Augustine, again, and others are thinking, part of what's so cool about Plato is that there's this immortal soul, and it's a rational soul, and it can think and make decisions and such, Boethius is really pushing it even further and talking about, this was also for Aristotle, that rational means that we have to intellectualize, we have to really delve deep and struggle with these concepts and with these ideas, and then come out knowing what the right thing is, hopefully by the end. There is a lot to say about this man too, Anselm of Canterbury, and I will have to move quickly through him. The most important thing I think at this time to take away from him is how he inspires others. We might think of it as very naive today, and that's mostly due to the context of our times. But he does something that is actually pretty phenomenal in the sense that he tries something and fails, clearly fails, which is a proof of God. Ontological proof is what this is normally called. So what we'll see later is that there's the ontological proof of God, and this is Anselm's work. We want to contrast that to the cosmological proof of God, which we'll see later is mostly Aquinas' work. And while the division here is a little too clean to be completely correct, the basic way of thinking about this is that ontology is talking about, you could say, from way of pure reason. And this is something that, again, medieval philosophy is more and more starting to take on as its kind of MO, its modus operandi, which is ontology can be deciphered by way of reason, not simply what you observe about the world. Cosmological proof, then, for God, we'll see later, has more to do with knowing what we do about the world. How can we work backwards and say God must exist? Anselm has an ontological proof that basically goes like this. He says, 1, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. All right, that's premise 1. Premise 2, it is greater to exist than not to exist. 3, therefore, God exists. You can literally memorize this. You could write this on the back of an envelope, and there you have it. That is essentially what he is saying. It's a little more wordy on his part than that, but we want to think about what is he doing here? He's saying that there's this property of existence, right? That is, you either exist or you don't exist, and if you exist, you have the property of existence. This is very bizarre talk maybe to us now, but hold on tight because it plays an important part later on. People will refute these arguments precisely because of this property business. And so if God is that of which nothing greater can be conceived, that is, if you can think of nothing more incredible than the most omnipotent, the most omniscient, the all-knowingest, all most powerful being of the universe, then the thing that must make it so great, in addition to all the other properties you give it, is existence. What does he mean by that? He means that to exist is to be better than to not exist. Being Kelsey is great, but if I didn't have the property of existing, to use Anselm's words here, that is, if I was Kelsey, but not a real Kelsey, not a Kelsey that exists here, that you can talk to and interact with, that's not quite as great, is it? Anybody who has an idea of me is just kind of making up aspects of me and can do whatever they want with me and not necessarily have a genuine conversation with a real entity. So to exist for him is greater than not to exist. So if God is the greatest possible thing conceivable, then he must also include this property of existence. Therefore, God exists. Kind of an interesting argument when you think about it. And you can see how it isn't immediately refutable. It's definitely refutable, but it's not immediately refutable. And who refutes it? Well, not too much longer after this comes out, a very important man named Guanillo comes around and says, well, it's funny because there's an island that I can conceive of. Let's just call this the greatest conceivable island. This island has, all the luxuries. It has yachts and, beautiful people and a plethora of, coconut milk and all this other lovely stuff. Greatest possible thing. And of course, it must also include the property of existence, because everything that I can think of that would be great about this island is conceivable. So if that's your argument, and Guanillo, by the way, is not atheistic in this. He's not anti-theistic. He's not against the idea that God exists. But many, including him, want there to be an impenetrable argument. How can you come up with a real argument that is incapable of being refuted? Well, not by this argument, not by Anselm's ontological argument. If this is going to be your argument, they're saying just recognize how fallible it is and how this is going to be easily refutable by anyone who thinks about it for a few minutes. Nonetheless, there's something really cool going on here. It's almost like a little competition. I think of programmers going okay, so that program obviously sucked, but someone is going to try and write a better program. They're going to overcome the faults and everything, not because the goal was unworthy, but because it was just poorly written. So let's try again. Will end up being kind of the refrain here. Before we jump into the cosmological argument in regards to Aquinas, though, I want to mention Abelard as well, another person we're just skimming by. And poor Abelard here. Peter Abelard did so much also to bring in, of the parts of Aristotle most prominent for him, logic. Let us use logic. Now, it's unfortunately common for so many learners of philosophy to go, well, if you were using logic, you wouldn't be Christian in the first place. And I think that we have I think if you were to follow that train of thought far enough, you'd realize that there are all sorts of things that we take for granted in our modern day that are not necessarily Christian or even religious in our eyes, and yet we take as being bare bones must be true, such as the idea that the most fundamental constituents of reality are subatomic particles, maybe even quarks and strings. Keep that in mind. Abelard then says, within the context that he's in, that logic is the way forward. Absolutely. After all, logos, as was brought up by Heraclitus and others, and seen as, the word, the absolute means of reason and so forth, well, when you read the first pages of the Bible, God speaks the word. He speaks logos in this new interpretation, these newer interpretations of what is going on in Genesis. That is, logos emanates as the word of God. So now these people are saying, logic is the direct path to understanding by way of reason and rationality God's work, God's being, because logic is part of that structure of derivations from logos to rational, human being capable levels of logic. He's an incredible tutor. He creates his own theology and so forth. He gets mixed up in this little bit of an issue. Actually, one of his students he has a love affair with, and that's Heloise over on the right-hand side, who they also send to a convent, and it's pretty bad. I mean, even while she's in the convent, they're occasionally seeing each other. It's pretty bizarre situation and story. Go look it up sometime. Abelard and Heloise. Many people have already written extensively about their love affair. I won't say anything more about it. But Abelard as, again, a huge important element in the revival of Aristotle in the consciousness of philosophers now in the 1000s. 1079 to 1142 in his lifespan. Big deal. And now finally we're at the culmination point with Aquinas. I say culmination point because if you were to choose any one philosopher to potentially dedicate your career to from the medieval period, Aquinas would be the most likely option for the greatest number of people. In terms of depth, in terms of influence, in terms of, and I don't mean influence just in medieval times, influence today. The Thomists and so forth are continue to be something of a very interesting character of school of Aristotelian philosophy. So the man is wrestling with similar concerns, we could say, as Anselm, who we saw a moment ago, except that, like many others, he says, "Oof, this ontological proof just reeks of fallacy. It's so obviously off." He starts working on his own version of a proof of God. Let's talk Aquinas. How does Aquinas go about trying to prove God? Well, the cosmological argument is almost a misnomer. It almost should be called the cosmological arguments, in that he comes up with 5 different ways of trying to prove God. And they are very Aristotelian. Again, here we have the champion of Aristotle in the medieval times. So he starts with the argument from motion. He goes into argument from causation, then contingency, then degree, and then final cause. Now, these are all maybe somewhat opaque, but if we take just one example, the most commonly rehearsed example, but still a good one, where the argument from motion, you can see where Aristotle plays into this. Do you remember the unmoved mover that we talked about in the last lecture? There was this idea of, well, at some point there had to be something or somebody, something, for Aristotle it's more of a something, I think, that then causes everything afterward to domino effect in order for, so that you don't you don't fall into this other potential fallacy of infinite regress, where there's not, you keep going forever. There's always going to be a B that explains the C, but then an A that explains the B, and then ultimately a Z naught that explains the A, and a Y naught that explains the Z naught, and so forth. It goes infinitely regressing, never to a beginning point. And remember, this is now a much more linear model than even before. If the Indo-Europeans were, as Gaarder tries to characterize them, mostly cyclical in their thinking, and the Semitic, and therefore later lines of Christianity, Christian thinking and so forth, are particularly linear. There's a genesis, and there's a point in the future where of Judgment Day, and so on and so forth, that's going to be the end, as it were, of the world as we know it. Then you can't go infinitely back. So to deal with this problem of infinite regress again is to look at it as a contradiction. This is another really important term of ours. Contradiction, the opinion that opposite assertions are not simultaneously true, in the words of Aristotle. So the contradiction here looks as the following. Let's go back to the argument from motion. Motion here you can think of as a cause as well. It's the same basic idea, but imagine the billiard balls. A motion of one billiard ball hitting the next billiard ball causes that one to move. So there's motion, there's causality. The idea here then is that if you go, again, infinitely backward through the causes of motion, you eventually have to get to a point where you have a potential and an actual. Remember me using those terms before in regard to Aristotle? Potentiality is what things are they are not in their maturity yet. They are being pulled by a final cause into being. So the actual something or other, the actual being, is going to be something that is led up to by, it starts potential. Think of potential and kinetic energy, if that's more useful, if you know the physics of that. Then basically until the kinetic energy happens, or until something is actualized, you're in a potential form. And at some point, I mean, every potential form is, as it were, induced or sparked by an actualized form already. You can't have a baby human without there also being two grown humans coming together and making the baby. You can't have a billiard ball just up and start moving on its own without another billiard ball hitting that billiard ball and causing that one to move forward. So at some point, you have to have an actualized being. And if you can't infinitely regress backward, you can't start with the potential, because the actual always begins or starts or initiates the potential. Then there must be an actual being that starts it all. God. There you have it. Now, of course, there are problems with this too. The most obvious fallacy that most people like to talk about is what's called begging the question. So begging the question in this case looks like, for Aquinas, him basically saying, look, there had to be some actualized thing that began the first movement. If there wasn't, then there would be no first thing that began the movement or began the causal chain. So in other words, there must be one, because if there wasn't, there wouldn't be one. And you see the circularity in there again. This is begging the question, is another way of talking about this one. It isn't necessarily a mic drop argument, let's say, or that is pointing out that fallacy doesn't necessarily completely rule out what he's saying, but it does make it weaker. And so we can see again that logic still at the time that it's being applied, and all the way up to the modern day, still being wrestled with, still being contended with by philosophers, medieval and modern. It won't be for a while, but definitely within the period prior to the Renaissance, that people start to realize maybe proofs of God are just not possible, not because God doesn't exist, they say, but because proofs of God would just not be possible in the first place. Maybe they even try to encapsulate a God that is impossible to encapsulate. After all, if this is a God that really is greater than anything we can maybe greater than what we conceive, not just the greatest thing we can conceive, but greater than anything we can conceive, how could we possibly build a logic that proves anything about it? That seems to be a notion that doesn't just relate to God, but if you think about it, modern physics today even is struggling with this. Is it possible for us who are exploring the universe to actually truly conceive of its fundamental reality? Or is that precisely where, if you're playing a video game, there's almost always that point where you reach the boundary beyond which the programmers didn't program?
You see, a normal player would have slipped off there, but because I'm so good at Mario, I just hit that invisible wall and fall down instead. That's how cool I am.
You can't have an infinite unfolding world within a video game. You reach this wall eventually, and now you're up against the wall, and yes, there's sky, and yes, there's trees, but it's all, or maybe it's a ceiling, at some point you reach the ceiling of the game. Maybe those are the boundaries. Maybe God, or the fundamental constituents of the universe, or let's not use constituents, fundamental reality of the universe is beyond that threshold. Now that's very transcendental, and I think there's another way to approach the problem, but I won't get into that right now. Hopefully one of the things you're also seeing at play here is so many of the questions that we've been wrestling with in Sophie's world. Where does the world come from, for instance? And Sophie thinks of this in terms of nothing coming from nothing, and so forth. This is so still important right now. We have not ditched those questions. We're still wondering where the world comes from. Our world, Sophie's world. And if nothing can come from nothing, well, this is exactly the sort of question that Aquinas is wrestling with too. If nothing can come of nothing, then and there can be no infinite regress, there must be something. So we can see that precisely in order for Sophie to move forward on her journey and understand her own world, she has to wrestle with the same questions as even these middle-age philosophers, these medieval philosophers that come hundreds, even 1,000 years before her. And that's pretty phenomenal, if you ask me. One of the distinguishing characteristics of philosophy is how those questions can last for so long and be discovered to have yet more and more nuances than we at first originally thought. In the next in-depth look lecture, we're going to be talking about possibly the most exciting time in philosophy, particularly for yours truly, the Renaissance, perhaps second only to the ancient times themselves. So, looking forward to that. Talk to you then.